Hey guys, it's Shaylin and I'm here today with another writing video. So in today's video, I'm going to be just talking about every short story that I failed to write. I thought that this would be an interesting opportunity to go through all the short stories that I tried to make work and for whatever reason, I just couldn't get them to work, and why they didn't work and kind of what I learned from that experience. Not everything you try to write is going to work out well, and the novel, I usually am pretty sure that I'm ready to commit to the novel before I start writing it because it's such a big task. But with short fiction especially, I am really prepared to just throw anything at the wall and see what sticks. And so as a result, a decent amount of the time, it does not stick. And I do think that it's better to try and have it not work out than to just not try at all. I think I've written, I don't know how many, like 35, 36, 37 short stories or something. Some of them have turned into some of my favorite things that I've ever written, and they got published, and I'm super proud of them, and I'm gonna put them in a collection someday. Others, I maybe never finished the first draft. Or maybe I did multiple drafts and despite that I just could not get it to work. I kind of just like to normalize projects not working out and that being fine. First short story that I officially have laid to rest, which was called Dramatis Personae. One day I'm in class and someone's like, should we be starting to think about our second story? And the prof, who was a bit of a hard ass, goes, you should have already started it. And you could just feel the whole class tense up and panic. Right after the prof had given me this beautiful gift, you should have already started, which I had not. Went home and I immediately started writing another story. I wrote one page, it didn't go anywhere. I don't really remember anything about it. That weekend I'm on a road trip to Portland. We're staying in a hostel. There's like no one else there. The hostel's completely empty, probably because it was December. Clearly I was just looking for inspiration, whatever was directly in front of me at the time, because I needed a short story. So a girl backpacking through Europe with her boyfriend, and he dumps her while they're traveling together in the wake of this breakup, kind of hanging out at a hostel, and there's a bunch of really weird people there. I will say it was probably more advanced for my skills at the time because it was actually kind of experimental. It was formatted as a play. It was written in second person. Of all the stories on this list, this is actually maybe one of my favorites. I actually really like this story. At the time that I wrote it, it wasn't my favorite. I was kind of unsure about it. I think because it was a little different from me, but I remember my class, like the workshop, really liked it. Later in the year, in the fall, I did a juicy revision of the story. And for a while I was like, I want to put this in my collection, but I don't feel like it really fits. Like the tone is so different. My collection that I was writing was really like sharp and mythic and brutal, but also fabulistic. And then there was this story, which was just kind of like funky and comic. The execution of this story was actually great. I actually think I executed it really well, but it's really hard to make this concept work because girl backpacking through Europe is frankly not that interesting. It's hard to feel any kind of sympathy for someone who is having a hard time while backpacking through Europe. Hard to toe this balance where anything the character goes through feels so self-pitying. It's like you put yourself in a very privileged situation by going on a trip abroad, and now you're just kind of pitying yourself because things aren't going well. While also then having any kind of like, ooh, I found myself while traveling moment just feels very cheesy. And so eventually I realized that the execution was just so much better than the concept, and that I had actually executed the story really well. Like, in terms of the actual concept and therefore the arc of the story, what was it doing that was original? So I kind of just decided to lay this one to rest. So the next story that I tried and failed to write is called Anatomy, and I actually did several drafts of this one. This one was one of the wackiest concepts, and I think the wackiness of the concept was part of what made it hard to pull off in the end. So I wrote this in like the spring of 2017, so I was still really new to short fiction. I think it was like my 5th short story that I'd ever written, and this was a short story about a woman who lives isolated on an abandoned tree farm. And like the whole context around it is really unbelievable. It's like her parents, it was their farm and they like died when she was a kid. She's just lived there on this tree farm alone since. She cares about all these trees. They're like her children. And then there's this big redwood on like the border of the farm, the forested border of the farm, but it falls and like crushes a bunch of them. And so she's like wants to get revenge on it. So she like tortures this tree. Tried it in a lot of different formats. Tried to write it once from the tree's perspective. So it was like collective POV from the tree's perspective of them talking to the main character. Eventually I ended up writing it in third person. Oh, at one point there were like multiple sections in different POVs. Like there was like one from the tree's perspective. There was one from like a boy. What was his deal? I actually don't know. He like was like I don't understand clearly he had nothing to do with anything, and then eventually I wrote it in just like a seamless third person, but the trees could talk, so like the main character was hearing the trees talk to her. Every detail I say about this is more and more unhinged. It kind of did fit the vibe of my collection because my whole first collection is frankly fully unhinged. I couldn't really tell you what was being said through this extremely bizarre chain of events that happens. And I just felt like there was no depth. I just felt like it was absolute weirdness and violence for no purpose. I couldn't make the situation feel comprehensible, and I couldn't make this character feel comprehensible because she's not. This story was like takes place in a bubble reality where logic doesn't exist. In the end, I was like, what am I saying in this piece about torture? I don't know. The next story that I couldn't get to work was called Wolf or Shush Wolf. Jury's still out on how we're supposed to say this. So this is a story about a boy whose sister was like abducted by a wolf pack. I found her and like reintegrating her into the family, and it's super vibey and moody, and I actually think a lot of the prose was great, and I actually think some of the character work was pretty subtle and interesting. This was the roughest workshop that I ever had. I've always had a really positive experience with writing workshops, but this one, the vibe was just really off. My prof really didn't like the story, and it was also my first workshop with a new prof, so I was more nervous, I think, than usual. I only had to revise one story that semester, and so I revised the other story, which was I Will Never Tell You This, Magnum Opus. And I just never looked at this one again. And to be honest, I haven't really looked at it since. You know, for a long time I was like, I'm gonna revisit this story. There are a few reasons why I didn't. I felt like it was treading ground that other stories in my collection had already tread. At the time, I did not realize that Girl Raised by Wolfpack was actually like a genre of short fiction. It's like a common trope in short fiction. I thought I'd had this very original idea, but I actually had not. This is like a whole thing in short fiction. Stories about girls raised by wolf packs. My impression of it had been very soured by this workshop, and then once I kind of really thought about it, I was like, the story is not as original as I thought it was. It's not really adding anything to my collection, and so I kind of just moved on from it. So next up we have a couple stories that I never actually completed the first draft of. So the next one was called Lung. I had this idea to write a story about a girl who falls in love with a boy made of air, and he just like is slowly disintegrating. This was when I was very in my fabulism era. I don't really write much fabulism anymore, but at the time, I loved a fabulism. I could never get the first draft to work. I tried to write the story like 4 times in different structures. In retrospect, I think I was just a closeted lesbian. I think the story was just too hetero for me. You know, when I look back on my first short story collection, there are a lot of heteros in that book, but they're all problematically depicted. This is why, again, you should never let a closeted lesbian write a short story collection, because I will problematically depict heterosexuality. There are a few queer stories in that book, but there are also a lot of stories about straight couples having the most messed up relationships you've ever seen in your life. Trying to write a wholesome story, I just was like, what is the point of this? Why should I care? Like, I couldn't get myself to care about the relationship. Maybe if I tried to write this story again, but I made it sapphic, it could work. I literally tried to write it once as reverse chronology. You know it's a last-ditch effort when you're bringing out the reverse chronology. Next short story that I couldn't get to work, I was working on it around the same time. Ooh, big siren! It was called 27 Shots. This was based on real life. So when I was in university, sometimes when you're in university, you do weird shit at 4 a.m. Some truly iconically weird things happened. I had the idea that I wanted to write a short story in the form of a disposable camera. So my idea was to write a short story about someone who's looking through all the photos from a disposable camera to try and figure out what happened the night that they were blackout drunk. I think my issue here was twofold. First of all, the fact that I based the characters on real people, which I don't really do. I got pretty deep into the story. I actually really liked the writing. I thought it was really cool. I couldn't figure out where to take the story from a certain point. I would love to revisit the idea now that I have so much distance from it and maybe start fresh with completely new characters. I think I was also soured on the idea because one of the people that this had happened with, who I based a character on, ended up being a terrible person who deeply traumatized myself and everyone in that friend group. And so I felt like I almost couldn't even look at the story for a while. I think I just couldn't figure out where to take the story. I couldn't figure out how to separate story from real life. So the next story that didn't work out is maybe like the worst one on here. I hate one of the worst stories on here. It's called The Lamb. So I wrote this story after my 3rd year of university. I had this huge writing slump. I was so burned out trying to get on my writing slump, and so I tried to write this story. It was so hard to write because I was coming out of a writing slump. The story is just about a woman who lives on like a farm, and then her daughter comes back to visit, brings her new boyfriend home, and that type of story. Maybe I wasn't mature enough as a writer because I think it took me a lot of time to be able to write those quieter pieces. I feel like at the time I was in my fabulism era where like every story was wild. It was either wildly fabulous or someone would die. Didn't have the touch, the delicacy yet with short fiction to write these more subtle nothing happens stories. I really failed to find the story in this really quiet situation. First draft turned out so poorly. I didn't really like anything about it. Now I want to go read it. I haven't read it in years. It was just a terrible story that I had to get out of the way to start writing better short fiction again. The next one that didn't work out is actually maybe my favorite of all of these and one that I actually really like. So it's called Bone Cathedral. It went through a lot of different titles. It originally had this really long title. It was called like All the Moons in the Sky simultaneously, which I don't really know what the point of that title was. But anyways, call it Bone Cathedral, which I really like that title, and I think I'm actually probably going to steal that title and use it for a collection in the future. So this was a story about a witch who like lives in a converted barn with her two besties, and the two friends had brought home this new roommate. He was like in a cult, but he ends up dying. He dies in like a weird freak accident, and it's about them trying to resurrect him. It was super cool. It was witchy. The prose was wild. There was like a really interesting throuple polyamory dynamic at the center. Obsessed with this story actually, and I would love to reread it because I haven't reread it in a while. The issue with this story is that it was too complicated to be a short story. This short story was like 8,000 words long. Frankly, was still missing a lot. Like, this short story just should be a novella. Really complicated, and I realized that I probably should actually write it to be linear. To make it linear would be to make it a lot longer, and I didn't really know what I would do with that novella. I was like, it's too long to go in a collection. Felt like it didn't really fit in either of my collections. The vibe fit in my first collection, but the character really didn't. My first short story collection is very characterized by people who have very unstable senses of self. Character wasn't like that. She was just like chill and witchy, and she didn't fit the other characters in Pareidolia. And then that like witchy vibe didn't really fit in my second collection. It would be a lot of work for something that I don't know what I would do with it. I liked the story as it was, but I knew that it had a lot of issues. To be fixed would require a huge increase in the word count, and I didn't feel like it was worth it just to be able to publish it. I didn't really know what avenue I would take trying to publish a piece of that length. I didn't need publication to be the end goal for this one. I was happy with it just being a piece for me that I wrote, and so I kind of just left it as is. I have two stories that were both huge flops. This was my flop era for short fiction. In the summer of 2019, like August, I got two ideas for two short stories at the same time, and I failed both of them. So the first one was called The Subtle But Key Difference Between Shoegaze and Dream Pop. So this story is one of the funniest pieces I've ever written. I love the title, actually. I think it's hilarious. This is just a short story about a roadie for like a small indie rock band. She's on tour with this band. She doesn't care about the band. She's having a fling with one of the other roadies that she feels very lukewarm about, but she kind of starts to fall for like the band's lead singer, and it's just another problematic depiction of heterosexuality. I don't know, are the streets gonna cancel me for problematically depicting the straight lifestyle? I really like a lot of what's in this story. I think it's very sardonic. It's one of those stories where the main character is utterly pathetic. I just couldn't get the end to land. Pretty small issue, and I feel like if I wanted to, I could just get it critiqued and probably fix it up, but I never bothered because it's so out of tone with both of my short story collections. I didn't really see a future for the piece in terms of publication, so I kind of just left it as a first draft because it was just tonally so different from the rest of my work. I wrote another story around the same time that also flopped called Migration of Crows. I actually had this workshopped. So this was a story about a woman who lives alone, very reclusive. She has like a really traumatic job. She does content monitoring online, like removing flagged posts from websites, which can be like a really traumatic job. A crow starts appearing at her window and she becomes like kind of obsessed with it. In the past, it was like a dual timeline. We follow her romance that she's having with a fellow pianist at a music conservatory, and then the main character's piano career ended because she lost two fingers. It felt very metaphorical, like the crows felt like they should be very metaphorical. What were they a metaphor for? I don't know. I'm waiting. You tell me. I never figured that out. Grief, loss, something very obvious, but yet it also didn't really work or tie together. At the time, I was really struggling to connect to a lot of my pieces. I felt like I was only connecting to like one in every 3 stories. Okay, so then is a story that I think is probably one of the strongest pieces from this list, and is one that I'm still, I don't know about. It's a word that rhymes with fishhook. This story began as a screenplay. I was taking a class on apocalyptic film, and we could do a creative project instead of a final paper, and I was like, well, I'd way rather do a creative project. So I wrote the screenplay. I don't really know like what I would do with this screenplay, so I'm like, I like the idea in it, so I'm gonna rewrite it as a short story. And it was a story about the robot apocalypse from the POV of a robot. I actually, for a period of time, really liked this story, and I actually even submitted it. And the thing about this story is that the first half is great. The first half is like internal monologue from this robot's POV, and it has some really interesting lines about like the line between love and ownership. And then the second half of the story was the literal apocalypse, and that just felt really rushed. But I just felt like that second half was just like pure, it was just action, and I just couldn't get it to land because it was originally a screenplay, which is like action, right? And I had a whole motif, and I realized that it doesn't work for a very small technical reason. I was going to put this in my second collection for a really long time. I wanted my second collection to have some more genre pieces. I have a fantasy piece and a historical piece in there. It just was noticeably so much weaker than all the other stories in the book. I have so many short stories. If one is not up to snuff, away she goes. So the next story, if I were thinking what are the worst short stories I've ever written, it's this one and The Lamb. And it's called Technically a Baroness. So years ago, my old housemate was telling us about how his mom was technically a baroness. Her family lost all of their money and land and wealth in World War II, but they still technically had the titles. His mom was like technically a baroness, like she had the title of a baroness, but she lost it because she married a commoner. And I always thought that that was such a fun detail for a character who is technically a baroness, but it's like a completely meaningless thing. So I've been keeping that in the back of my mind for a while. And I ended up pairing it with this random idea about a woman who, a plane, like a 2-person seaplane, crashes in her yard, and she like rescues the pilot. And then there was this other whole thing about how like she had like a conjoined twin, but they were separated at birth, but like the twin died. This story was just actively bad. The writing quality was really poor. It was just another story where I was like, so what? This amounts to nothing. I think I had a similar issue as with Migration of Crows, where I had a lot of really specific character details. Like in Migration of Crows, I was like, okay, she's a content monitor. She's being harassed by a crow. She was going to be a concert pianist, but then she lost 2 fingers and it ended up ending her relationship with her first love. Like, so many interesting things going on. I couldn't tie them together in a meaningful way. And then with Technically a Baroness, I was like, okay, so she technically has baroness status. But like it's completely meaningless in her life. She had a conjoined twin. She was separated from at birth, but the twin died. She makes stained glass windows. She's staying at her aunt's cabin to try and sell it because the aunt is the one family member who didn't disown her when she came out as a lesbian. She rescues a pilot from a plane crash, and they have weird romantic tension. Both of these stories had so much going on, and I could not find cohesion between these elements. It was like all these really specific quirky story elements that I couldn't find connection between. And I think at the time I just kept conceptualizing short stories by throwing together these really hyper specific details and going, they'll click, it'll all fit together, and then it wasn't. The next story that I wrote is one that I have actually, I think, talked about multiple times on this channel because I put in my time with this one. Can't get it to work. And it's the story where the tiger kills the wolf. This is still to this day one of the best concepts that I cannot get to work. So this story was about a man in a cult who was like raised in a cult, as you are if you're in the Jalen Bishop short fiction extended universe, you will be in a cult. It's set the night before everyone in the cult is going to partake in a mass suicide ritual. It's like mostly about him and his wife and like their interactions on this night. And there's like a whole thing about moths. I don't really know. Interwoven through this, there's this bedtime story that his mom used to tell him about a bunch of scientists on an island. I think the issue is that I could never figure out what I was saying about the characters through these different elements. I had this bedtime story. I couldn't land on a parallel that was both significant but not too clean. Any parallel either felt way too obvious or like way too much of a stretch. I couldn't get them to speak together in like a braided way that really I felt earned its place. I had this relationship between these two characters who had an interesting dynamic, and I was compelled by both characters. At the same time, I didn't know what I was really saying about them. Is this just a story about this man realizing that he's been indoctrinated? Because I feel like should be something deeper there, because it feels like that's obvious from the start. Like, there was nothing really revelatory about it. Had a few friends read it, and every person who's read it is like, I'm like, this is terrible, help me fix it. And then they read it and they're like, I don't know what to say. This is really good. And they're like, I really like it. Like, I think it's, I genuinely enjoyed it. I do think this story has potential. I think I could revisit this at some point in the future, and I think I could make it work. Possibility there. I don't think this one is done forever. I don't think any of these stories are necessarily done forever. I think any of them I could revisit. This is maybe the one that I would most like to revisit. But every time I've tried, I just can't get it to work. And so for now, I'm not really bothering. So then we have kind of a 2-for-1 story. It was kind of two different stories. This was early 2022. There was a writing contest that I really wanted to submit to. And I had been saying for a whole year, I'm gonna have a story to submit to this contest. The deadline was drawing near, and I did not. And so I was like, okay, let's make it happen. I'm just gonna do what I used to do in university. I'm gonna start writing, and it's gonna turn into something amazing and transcendent. That worked for me in university a few times. Well, it didn't work this time. So I started writing this story, and my working title was They Leave, which I do not like as a title, but whatever. I was really lukewarm about it, and I couldn't really figure out the concept of it. It was like a woman with her brother's wife, and they were just like driving together. They're just like in the car. I scrapped that, and one weekend I was home alone. This was during Omicron, I think. So my roommates had both been exposed separately, and so they were both isolating. So I was home alone for the weekend with Toby, the cat. This weekend I was like, I'm gonna stay home, I'm gonna have a little writing retreat for myself, I'm gonna write a whole short story, and it's gonna be great. And then the weekend ended with me not having a short story, sitting on the ground, bawling because I decided that I didn't want to go to grad school. Even though I had been working on my grad school applications at that point 4 months at a time. The weekend really went according to plan. I tried to rewrite the story under a different context where instead of like being in the car, it's just about the main character and her brother's, who she's not close with, wife staying with her after they separate. My issue with this story is that I felt like as I started to write it, I felt like it was starting to hint at a dark room that I didn't want the story to go to. And I didn't really know how to redirect it. The final story that didn't work is one that I tried to write last year, and it was called Change for $1. It was CBC prize season, and so I was trying to write a story for the CBC prize, and my dad had texted me like a little anecdote of something he'd witnessed that he said reminded him of me and my high school friends, and it just got me thinking about the friendships I'd had at that age. Honestly, the issue with this story is that it was based on real people. It just felt too personal. It felt humiliating. I also hate writing characters based on myself, and it's also like I very much write in an explorative way, where as I'm writing, I'm exploring and figuring out the character and what I'm trying to say about the character, but in this case, it was like, the character's me. It was just too hard to extricate the story from my real life. I think those are all the stories that I could not make work. There are definitely stories on here that I could see myself revisiting. For now, I'm not really currently actively working on any of these stories and have kind of made my peace with maybe the fact that I may never get them to work, and that is okay. With short fiction, I have the mindset of I'm willing to try anything. It's so short that you can just try so many different things and you don't have to worry about it not working out. If it doesn't work out, it's not really a big deal. And I think a lot of my best short stories were born because I had that mindset where I was willing to just go for it and try anything. Sometimes that means they don't work, but sometimes that means they work fantastically. So that's kind of the mindset that I have with short fiction, and these are all the stories that just flopped. So that's all for this video, guys. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in another video.